Hello. In our last lecture, we looked at Rome's struggle for power against Carthage and Hannibal in the Punic Wars. In this lecture, we're going to turn our attention to some internal problems Rome had in the 1st century BC. Before we dive into that, though, I want to give you a quick update on some other events. You may recall that Macedon had allied with Hannibal right after the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. Once Rome had won the war against Hannibal and Carthage, they now went after Macedon to get back at them for doing this. There was a series of 4 wars, and over the course of these wars, they subjugated both Macedon and the rest of Greece. By 146 BC, both Macedon and Greece had become Roman provinces. In 129 BC, a king in Asia Minor left his territory to Rome. This became Asia, Rome's first province on the continent of Asia. So by the turn of the 1st century BC, Rome was well on its way to becoming an empire. Now all this expansion is actually going to cause a problem for Rome, because as Rome expands more and more, it needs more and more soldiers to take care of all this land, to expand, to conquer and everything. The problem was that in Rome at this time, only landowners could serve in the army. Well, that meant there weren't that many recruits, and also soldiers would have to tend their land. Because they were the landowners, they wanted to take care of their land, so they could only be away from Rome for a certain amount of time, away from home for a certain amount of time, because they'd always want to go back and take care of the land. So what was Rome going to do about this? How were they going to handle this manpower problem? Well, in 107, this man, Marius, became the new consul. Remember, the consul are the military administrative leaders of Rome. They're appointed for 1 year. Well, when Marius becomes consul, he makes a number of military reforms. One of the things that he does is that he abolished the property requirements for people to serve in the army. What this meant was that he now opened soldiering to the poor. This was very good because it gave the poor a chance to get wealth, a chance to improve themselves by joining the military. And of course it gave Rome a lot more soldiers available. Now Marius did one other thing. He also wanted to look out for his soldiers after they had retired. So he sought to gain land for them once they had finished their service, and he managed to acquire some land for them. So now they would have a place to go and settle down, their own territory, their own land. Well, it's really nice of him, maybe, but it sets a very dangerous precedent, because what happened then was he was setting the idea that soldiers would become dependent on the general. First they were dependent on the general for wealth, for giving them the position, but then also when they were done, for the land that they were going to get. So it was the general who was taking care of them. So they become loyal to the general rather than to Rome. They're serving the man, not the state. So the army becomes now an instrument of very ambitious generals. These generals could use the army to gain political power. Basically, Marius has shown that no one could rule Rome without an army. So very ambitious men are going to try to become generals. Now, the way to become a general is to get yourself appointed as a proconsul. These were the governors of the various provinces that Rome had. And the proconsuls had complete military authority in those territories. So you'd be given an army in that territory if you could be appointed proconsul. So this is going to be something that a lot of these ambitious guys are going to go after. Now, one of those very ambitious generals was this gentleman, Pompey, or Pompey the Great. He lived from 106 to 48 BC. Pompey was a very successful, a very popular general. He won everywhere he fought. And so as time is going along and he's winning and he's gaining, he's got all these good veterans, he's hoping to find a place like Marius had done where he can settle his veterans, reward them for all the help that they've given him. Well, the Senate at this time fears his power, and they're pretty much jealous of him, so they don't grant his request. Now, Pompey could go and turn the army on Rome, as some others had done earlier, but he decides he's going to look for political allies instead to try to get what he wants. So what Pompey does is he allies with Crassus and this gentleman here, Julius Caesar. Caesar lived from 100 to 44 BC. In the year 60 BC, the three of them form what is called the First Triumvirate, an alliance of three. They're going to combine their influence to try to get what each of them wants. For example, Pompey wants the land for his veterans, and the legislation is passed with the help of Crassus and Caesar. Now, what Caesar wants is something quite a bit different. Pompey already has military power because he's had an army, he's been a proconsul. Caesar doesn't have that, and that's what he's looking for. He wants to become proconsul to get position with an army, and then once he gets an army, he'll have that backing, and that gives him political power as well. So eventually he's going to get himself appointed as proconsul to the territory of Gaul in the year 58. Up in Gaul, which is modern-day France, there were many local tribes fighting one another there. So this is a place where Caesar's got an opportunity to go in, conquer them, and make a name for himself. So in 58 BC, Caesar invades Gaul, beginning what is known as the Gallic Wars, which last until 51 BC. Caesar's very successful up there, defeating the Gauls, and he ends up adding Gaul as a province to Rome. Now, by the year 52, there was only one tribe still fighting the Romans. It was led by Vercingetorix, who is shown here on a contemporary coin, a coin from that time. Now, take a close look at this coin, because it leads to an interesting side story of how one person can change history long after the fact. Now, Vercingetorix is very popular in France. In the year 1865, a statue of Vercingetorix was commissioned, and here's the statue that he came up with. Now, do you notice anything different here about Vercingetorix? If you said the big bushy mustache, hey, good job, you're right on. Now, why the mustache? Why did the artist decide he's going to go ahead and give Vercingetorix a mustache? Well, the fact is that the ruler of that time, the ruler of France at that time, was the Emperor Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, here's what he looked like. Aha, okay, big bushy mustache. So the artist basically thinks that, he thought that he'd flatter the emperor by giving Vercingetorix a mustache, much like the emperor's mustache. Ever since then, Vercingetorix has been portrayed with a mustache. So here, take a look at some of these pictures. Here's a statue from 1903. Mustache. Here's a pipe from around 1925. Mustache. Here's a cartoon from 1969. Vercingetorix has a mustache. Here's a movie about Vercingetorix from the year 2001. And finally, here's a painting from around the year 2005. So as you can see, one artist has changed how Vercingetorix is seen. So anyway, Vercingetorix is doing his best to keep Caesar and the Romans at bay. He actually even manages to defeat Caesar in battle at one point. But then in the year 52 BC, Caesar traps Vercingetorix in the city of Alesia. Caesar begins to build an 11-mile line of siege fortifications around the city, making sure that Vercingetorix cannot escape easily. Well, Vercingetorix manages to send out people to looking for help. They go out to the Gauls trying to get somebody to come in and, reinforcements. Well, Caesar learns that Vercingetorix is sending out for this help. So what's he going to do now? If all of a sudden this huge force comes at him from behind, he's going to be in trouble. He cannot storm Alesia and take it that quickly. He can't starve out Vercingetorix in the time before the relief force is going to arrive. So what's he going to do? Well, he comes up with a very clever move. He decides he's going to build a second line of fortifications now a 14-mile line of fortifications, but these are facing outward. And he takes his army and he places it in between the two lines of fortifications, so now they're protected from both sides. So sure enough, when the relief force shows up, Caesar and his group are safe inside. Now, according to some sources, the relief force is some 250,000 men. Take that with a large grain of salt. Caesar supposedly has 70 to 80,000 men. Now he's got to face both of these armies, Vercingetorix and his men inside Alesia, and the big relief force outside. Vercingetorix attacks from inside the fort. The other Gauls attack from outside. Caesar and the Romans are now attacked on two sides. It's a very desperate struggle, a very desperate battle. There are many places where the Gauls manage to break through the lines, and very close hand-to-hand combat is going on. Caesar, in a flowing red cape, so his men can tell where he's at, he's racing into the thick of the battle where it's the most desperate, and right when he manages to balance things out, there's a problem over there, he races over there and fights it off, manages to take care of the situation there, and then over somewhere else. Back and forth he goes. It's a very desperate battle, very tough, but in the end, the Romans managed to fight off all the attacks. And so Vercingetorix is forced to surrender to Caesar. In the end, Vercingetorix was taken back to Rome and killed there. Well, as you can imagine, Caesar's victory up in Gaul makes him very popular with his army and with the people of Rome. But that popularity also brings power. And the power now is a threat to the Senate. So a number of members of the Senate begin to get really worried about Caesar. And actually, Pompey joins them. He decides that, yes, Caesar isn't... he could be a threat. And so in the year 50, the Senate decided to order Caesar home from Gaul. Caesar goes and he arrives at the Rubicon River. Now, the Rubicon River, it's not more than a little stream up in northern Italy. But what it does is it marks the northern border of Italy proper, Rome proper. Everything outside would be provinces of Rome. And the rule was that any army coming into Roman territory, into the central part of Rome, were supposed to lay down their weapons. They had to disband, lay down their weapons, and then the general could return. So, as Caesar comes up to the Rubicon, he's sitting there and he's looking at it and he's giving it some thought. He's got a dilemma now. Does he follow the law, disband the army, return to Rome? Now, if he does this could open him to prosecution. He's likely to lose power, and you never know, they might go and have him executed or whatever, do away with him as a threat. The other thing he could do is break the law. He could march on Rome with his army, but that means civil war. Well, Caesar decides he's better off taking the gamble. So he decides to cross the Rubicon. And as he goes across, supposedly he utters the phrase, "The die is cast." Meaning, I'm taking my gamble, here we go. There's no turning back at this point. Let's see what happens. The Senate, in response, give an army to Pompey to defend Rome, but Pompey realizes that he's not ready to fight Caesar. Remember, Caesar's got these legions here who have been fighting up in Gaul. They're great veterans now. They're well experienced. The army that Pompey is given is very weak. It's inexperienced. So Pompey flees over to Greece to go train his army. He goes to Greece because there are more resources there and everything. So he gets there. Well, Caesar eventually follows Pompey to Greece. In 48 BC, they fight a big battle. Now, Pompey has a much bigger army than Caesar, but Caesar's army is a much better army. And so when they meet at this battle, Pompey is completely defeated by Caesar's forces. Pompey manages to flee. He goes down to Egypt. As he's coming up on shore, as he's walking ashore, some of the men going out to greet him assassinate him. They kill him. Now, meanwhile, Caesar has learned that Pompey has gone off to Egypt. He goes off to Egypt. When he arrives in Egypt, the guys that had killed Pompey greet Caesar, and they present him with the head of Pompey. They do this trying to get on Caesar's good side, thinking, hey, they'll reward us for... Caesar will reward us for getting rid of his enemy. But instead, Caesar's very upset that they've done this, and he actually has them killed too. When Caesar gets into Egypt, he meets up with Cleopatra. He puts her on the throne, makes an alliance with her, puts her on the throne. And then he begins heading off around the Roman Empire, essentially on mopping up operations, taking care of a few other of Pompey's forces here and there, before he heads back to Rome in 45 BC. When Caesar returned to Rome, he soon had himself named dictator for life in 44 BC. So now basically what he's done is he's made himself a king in all but title. He's going to use his power now to execute a number of reforms. He announced a program of public works, repairing damage from the war, putting the poor to work. He instituted a moderate cancellation of debts. He divided Italy into municipal districts for more efficient administration. He reformed the calendar. He replaced the lunar calendar with a solar one, renaming the 7th month, which is today July, after himself. This Julian calendar, as we call it, remained in effect for 1,500 years, and it's the basis of today's Gregorian calendar. He established colonies for his military veterans. So he's doing a lot of stuff that is good. The people really like him. He's very popular amongst the people. They see him as a benefactor, someone who could restore order and prosperity. But there are a lot of political opponents that do not like him. The whole fact that he's called himself dictator for life, they see him as a king, a tyrant. When he came in, he increased the size of the Senate to 900 people, packing it with the number of his former military officers. So he's basically undermining the Senate's traditional power and authority, not to mention the fact that he's just an arrogant kind of guy. And so too many of the people in the Senate don't like him. Two in particular, Brutus and Cassius, are two senators who want to stop Caesar. Now, Brutus was a close friend of Caesar's, but one of his ancestors had been instrumental in overthrowing the last king during the monarchical period of Rome, some 500 years later, and so he felt it was his duty to get rid of tyrants, something they did in the family. So he and Cassius get together and they convince 60 other senators that Caesar must be killed. So they begin to plot against Caesar. The plot is going to take place on what is called the Ides of March. Ides, I-D-E-S, of March. That was the 15th of March in the year 44 BC. Supposedly, as the story goes, a soothsayer, a fortune teller, had warned Caesar not to be very careful of the Ides of March. Beware of the Ides of March. And when the 15th came, Caesar was out and he ran into the soothsayer again and he said, you see, the Ides of March have come. And the soothsayer says, Aye, Caesar, but they have not yet gone. But nonetheless, Caesar, ignoring any warnings, enters the Senate. When he gets in the Senate, the conspirators go up to him and they attack. They strike and stab at him mercilessly. He's hit some 23 times, and as you can imagine, as they're all swinging their swords and their knives and everything, they kind of end up nicking each other too. But in the end, Brutus goes in and delivers the final blow, and Caesar falls dead, supposedly at the foot of a statue of Pompey. But Caesar's death did not end the troubles in Rome, the civil wars and such. With him out of power now, there was a power vacuum. So there was going to be a question of who was going to rule Rome. So there'd be one final round of conflict between Mark Antony and this gentleman here, Octavius, who eventually is going to become known as Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. Augustus will indeed win the final round and establish once and for all the Roman Empire.